Here.
Deputy Mayor Herbig.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
Here. If you all stand, please, and join me in the flag salute. I pledge allegiance Next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. If there's no objections or changes, the agenda will stand approved as written. Next item on the agenda is a series of proclamations. The first one is whereas all people should have access to safe, healthy, and affordable homes within communities of opportunity. And whereas studies have found that each $100 increase in median rent results in a 15% increase in homelessness in metro areas and a 39% increase in homelessness in nearby suburbs and rural areas. And whereas the combined cost burden of housing plus transportation can be substantially reduced by locating affordable housing opportunities in proximity to transit. And whereas the all-home community identifies affordable housing as a critical component of making homelessness rare, brief, and one-time. And whereas everyone benefits from affordable housing, including the people who reside in these properties, their neighbors, businesses, employers, and the community as a whole. And whereas the Association of Washington Cities determined that enhancing efforts to increase affordable housing decreases homelessness and improves a strained behavioral health system was a critical priority for the 2019 legislative session. And whereas, united in an effort to raise public awareness, communities throughout King County are participating in local affordable housing week efforts to inform the public of the critical need to preserve and increase affordable housing in our communities. And whereas the City of Kenmore endorses the goals, objectives, and purposes of Affordable Housing Week, and in doing so, recommits itself to ensuring that our community thrives with opportunity and that all people in it live with dignity in safe, healthy, and affordable homes. Now, therefore, I, David Baker, Mayor of the City of Kenmore, Washington, on behalf of the City Council, do hereby proclaim the week of May 13th through 17th, 2019, as Affordable Housing Week in the City of Kenmore. And we have Lisa Sarowik here from the North Urban Human Services Alliance. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. My name is, again, Lisa Sarowik with NUSA, North Urban Human Services Alliance, and I want to thank you so much for proclaiming May 13th to 17th as Affordable Housing Week and for your recognition of the urgent need for affordable housing in our community. We're grateful for your leadership and work on policy solutions that will make a difference to these neighbors, and also thank you so much for your recent action on mobile home parks. NUSA's Affordable Housing Committee, and we hope that you will be able to attend. An overview by King County Housing Authority of its properties and its impact to the community here in North King County. That's coming up this Thursday from 4 to 5:30 at Ballinger Commons. We hope that you will continue to support housing affordability with all of the tools available to you. Thank you again for taking the time on this issue and proclamation and on your dedication to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Because we have somebody here to accept the next one, I'm going to go out of order. Whereas On average, 700 people die each year in boating-related accidents in the U.S., with the vast majority of those accidents caused by human error and poor judgment, and not by the boat, equipment, or environmental factors. And whereas a significant number of boaters who lose their lives by drowning each year would be alive today if they had worn their life jackets. And whereas the city of Kenmore is bounded by 7.8 miles of shoreline along Lake Washington, the Sammamish River, and Swamp Creek. And whereas a large number of Kenmore residents of all ages engage in recreational boating. And whereas the mission of the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary Division II, overseeing the North Shore area, is to promote and improve recreational boating safety by America's parks, public lands, and water. And whereas it's important to introduce a new generation to our nation's parks. And whereas we should encourage children to lead a more active lifestyle to combat the issues of childhood obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and hypercholesteremia. And whereas Kids to Parks Day is open to all children and adults across the country to encourage a large, diverse group of participants. And whereas Kids to Parks Day will broaden children's appreciation for nature and outdoors. Now, therefore, I, David Baker, Mayor, City of Kenmore, on behalf of the City Council, am pleased to proclaim May 18th as Kids to Parks Day and urge the residents of the City of Kenmore to make time on May 18th, 2019, to take the children in their lives to a neighborhood, state, or national park. And there is nobody here to accept this. So please, get your kids out to parks. All right. Next item on the agenda is citizen comments. This is an opportunity for you to express your views on issues that are important to you and to the community, and we ask that you please limit your comments to 3 minutes. Will the clerk please call the first person?
Is it at T. Jane?
If you
Hi.
could state your name for the record, please.
Navanka Bellini.
I'm Aditi Jain.
And I am Cassandra Houghton, student
And
leader.
one of the cities that you live in?
Awful.
Bothell? Okay.
So I'm in 8th grade and I go to Canyon Park Middle School.
I'm a junior at Englemore High School.
So we are here to invite you to North Shore's first annual Community Sustainability Summit on Wednesday, June 12th from 4 to 6:30 p.m. at Englemore High School. And the goal of this summit is to measurably improve the sustainability of our community and increase collaboration across different sectors. When we talk about sustainability, we mean working at the intersection of our needs for the environment, well-being, economic health, and equity, essentially the triple bottom line.
And the urgency for this can be seen in the smoky haze of last summer's wildfires. And the local policymakers have committed to this through the K4C, the King County Cities Climate Collaborative, which Kenmore is committed to, so thank you for that. And thank you so much for modeling it through this amazing LEED Gold certified building. However, almost every city is not on track to meet the 2020 commitments of reducing carbon emissions by 25%. And the summit is an opportunity for key community leaders to come together to work on this issue.
At the summit, leaders from across the community will come to report on what they accomplished around sustainability over the past year. And then participants will be able to co-create, based on those reports, what are our community priorities, what can we work on over the coming year. This model has been tried and tested in Lake Washington School District over the past 4 years and now is hosted at Microsoft every single year. The city of Sammamish, inspired by the Lake Washington model, hosted their first summit this year. In the coming weeks, we're hosting summits in the cities of Bellevue and Newcastle, and now these young leaders want to bring this model to your community, eventually building towards a regional summit.
We would like to invite the Kenmore City Council to participate in the following ways. The first way is report for 5 minutes on new sustainable policies, programs, and projects. And number 2 is to invite invested City Council members and city staff to engage in this opportunity. Thank you, Kenmore City Council, and we will follow up with more information and look forward to hearing your response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you could get us an invitation or some announcement in email or a PDF file that we can get, I'd appreciate it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lauri Jensen.
Hi, my name is Lauri Jensen, and I wanted to start out by congratulating Kenmore City Council for taking the lead in helping its citizens in mobile home parks. There was a Seattle Times article. It was my neighbor Chuck and my friend Stacy who applauded you guys. And you guys are, if not taking the lead in Kenmore, in the whole country. So with that, we are asking for your assistance again. And if I go beyond the 3 minutes, there's one case that's got me very emotional. So I hope that somebody will take time to talk with me afterwards. First thing is affordable housing you've been helping us with. In my Pacific Park, we are not being provided affordable housing. But worse than that, there are the most vulnerable within our park are being harassed, intimidated, to where it is becoming life-threatening. And we're coming to you first. Of course, we're going to go other places, but it's urgent. And so is any way you guys can help us? I'm leaving a note to what is going on in the latest specific case. The other thing is quite urgent in the sense that on May 9th, the governor signed into law Bill 1582, and there were 3 things that stood out on that that affected the landlords, and that was, the one thing was the 2-year rental agreement, and the second was tenants that pay utility and sewage and all other types of utilities outside of the rent amount, that their rent be decreased proportionately. And the third thing was on late rents, to which people have until the 14th to turn in their bills, and with Social Security that'll be really helpful because many of our tenants get extraordinarily huge late fees every month. What happened was quite strange. On May 9th, the governor signed the bill into law. On May 10th, the next day, everyone that had not received their lease, like normally I would get mine in June, Chuck would get his in July, and we would have like 6 weeks to sign the lease and get it sent early to get our, and this year, $25 discount. The people that had got their rent increases prior to this time were mostly single wide trailers, and their rent was increased $100. I live in a double wide on the water side, and my rent increase was less than theirs. Not
Ms.
by
Jensen,
much, but it was still less.
We're
and
at
I'm
3
over.
minutes.
Okay, can I just take 30 more seconds? This is quite urgent. Okay, so what we need your help
Go ahead
on
and
is,
say it, but try to wrap it up, please.
I'll wrap it up, is this. On our leases that were delivered to us, they said we had 2 weeks versus 6 to 8 weeks to sign our leases. It had to be in before May 30th. They had to receive it. And if we sign the lease, we would not, I'm assuming, get the new bill, things that are on the bill. And so many of our tenants, I'm the president of our HOA, so I get to hear all the stories. And most of it, well, because the $25 discount, I'm going, well, just wait, don't quite sign yet, because I don't want you to be locked into, we've got a little break here in the new bill. And, but they only have like a week to decide that, and we're not sure how that bill works. So that's what I wanted to ask you guys, and how you can help us. We called the Attorney General, and they said, get a lawyer. So, but we need some help on that. Thank you.
Carina File.
Hello, I'm Carina File, a resident of Kenmore, and I'm concerned for our community. I've been out meeting our neighbors and talking with them, going door to door, and what I'm seeing more of and hearing more of in our schools pathway are families who are multi-generational families. This has happened because their parents can't necessarily live and afford on their own, so they're moving home with their kids. Or their kids, who are grown adults, may be having struggles of their own. They are choosing between work and childcare. And it's easier for mom and pop, or mom or pop, to move home and help with the childcare. And so as Kenmore is planning our new development and our new growth, we really need to be mindful of this new pattern and new trend. And it's a bit of a crisis. If you go over to 73rd, there are two seniors who've been part of our community with nice homes who hope to retire here. They are both selling their homes. They can't afford the property taxes. They can't afford the improvement to build a mother-in-law apartment or accessory a unit on their property. The process is expensive and it's difficult. So instead of being able to retire where they've hoped to dream to live, they're now selling their homes. To go a half block down the street and into a cul-de-sac, you talk to another gentleman who bought a house with three of his sons, or two of his sons, pardon me, and they're flipping that property so they can earn a good income off of the quality and the availability they can get on that property. So while we have McMansions being built, and we have a duty to support the contract agreement with Metro to keep our transit here in our area, and that 5-story agreement, we can't just be looking at 60% of the mean. We really need to be looking at workforce housing. Our housing needs to be available to people who both work here and live here. They need to be able to work, live, and play in their neighborhoods. We need to be able to have small businesses to be able to thrive, and that small business needs to also attach to homes without a difficulty being so difficult. And we can look back to our nation's history of the Depression and look that it was being able to have these opportunities to be able to thrive in one's own home so they could sustain their home. And I would hope that we could work with our community to envision that kind of a Kenmore. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fowle.
Mayor, there's nobody else signed up.
Anybody else wishing to be heard? Anybody else? Thank you all for your comments. Thank you, Ms. Fowle, for your comments. Ms. Jensen, I gave Ms. Valenzuela some information tonight. If you want to check with her, please. I think you've got some contact information. I think that might help you on this. So in any event, thank you for your comments. Next item on the agenda is a presentation. And our city attorney, Mr. Rod Casaguma, has been Kenmore's city attorney since January 2005. More than 14 years. He's an excellent attorney, and he's played a key role in propelling Kenmore on its upward trajectory. Rod has been involved in reviewing and preparing ordinances on all elements of the comprehensive plan and many amendments to the municipal code. He's been involved in representing the city at hearings, appeals, and negotiations. Not to mention he has sound legal advice and opinions, and he is also a great writer and editor. He's been involved with, and here's a few of the things, the city's first critical area regulations and shoreline master program and updates, the annual comprehensive plan updates, city's first tree regulations and amendments, the city's first wireless communications facility regulations, zoning code streamlining, regional business zoning, property acquisitions and development agreements for the redevelopment of Kenmore Village, the city's first multifamily tax exemption regulations, the city's first transit-oriented development regulations, utility franchise agreements, the Bastyr University Master Plan, Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, capital project contracts and grant agreements, including all phases of the SR 522 safety improvements. And trust me, there's a lot more. Rod has a brilliant legal mind, and he's also a wonderful person. And we're going to miss you, Rod. We really are. And we wish you the best in your retirement. And thank you for all of your outstanding service to the city of Kenmore. And I have a little something for you. A couple of these are hanging in Washington, D.C., so in our delegation's offices, so you're in good stead here. I guess we can go out there. So I'm sure you will find out. I think our esteemed city manager, Mr. Carlincy, has something for you too.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. It's really been a privilege working with you, Rod, and you're just a classy individual, and you've worked so hard for the city. And there's lots of things that we've appreciated about you. One is, as an attorney, that's fraught with and all that, and that's your job, but you also help us get from point A to point B. You're a very practical attorney, and you've really helped us accomplish a lot. So, I think you're a really good writer too. Usually if somebody marks up a document that I've written, I kind of cringe and go, oh, but with your edits, I've come to enjoy all your red markups. So, because I'm like, oh yeah, that's a much better way of saying that. Oh yeah, good point. So I just really appreciate your skills and your contribution to our team. And the management team, we all chipped in together and got you a little gift card to a local restaurant, so thank you.
Management team? So we're going to take a few minutes break here.
Do I have a chance to just say a couple words?
Absolutely. It's not like I've not heard an attorney once.
Attorneys have to say something. Mr. Rao here. I can see you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for this recognition. I really appreciate it. And to think that there's two of them, it's really wonderful. I have to admit that I wrote a few notes down because I thought, in case I get choked up or my mind goes blank because I'm really sad to be leaving, I better write a few notes down. But before the meeting tonight, I ran into Mayor Baker in the parking lot. I saw Nancy Owsley, and we talked for a couple of minutes, and then just before the meeting, I had an opportunity to say a few words to Rob Carlinzi, the city manager. And before I got here an hour and a half ago, I wasn't as sad as I am now. I have to say that it is really sad for me to be retiring, first of all. I should say, I'm happy to be retiring. But it's really sad to be leaving all of you because you are just wonderful people. I'd like to acknowledge just a few folks and individuals. First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank the current city council and previous city councils. You had a vision to make this a vibrant and energetic city with a business-friendly environment, but taking into account the needs and desires of our citizens. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank the current staff. You learned how to effectively use our city attorney services, which is very good for the city. And I've become very good friends and acquaintances with many of you, and you know who you are, and I'll always be thankful for that. I want to particularly thank my Inslee Best team, because listening to all those accomplishments that the mayor said, I didn't do those all myself. And obviously, those are accomplishments and things that all of us achieved together over a number of years, which, as the mayor said, has been January 2005. So that's, I guess, 14 years last January. And I couldn't have done this without my Inslee Best team. And you know many of them, but I want to say their names for all of you and for those of you in the audience. Don Raytan, Rosemary Larson, Kathy Weber, Bill Linton, Kinnan Williams, Kay Brossard, Curtis Chambers, Jake Stillwell, and our newest member, Charlie Archer, who many of you are going to be meeting in the next couple of months. I want to recognize particularly and acknowledge Steve Anderson, because he's the person who hired my firm. And he allowed us to prosper as city attorneys, which was the beginning of this wonderful career with the city. And I also want to particularly thank Rob Carlindsey. He has become a good friend and someone I admire very much. But I thank him for implementing his team approach to city management and then integrating our firm into that approach, which I think has been a very successful component of this city's success. You know, I have just a couple more minutes. I want to say that I've gone through this retirement thing for the last couple of weeks, and people keep asking me repeatedly, well, what are you going to do? And I have to tell you, like I've told a number of other people, that I have purchased a stack of books about 4 feet high from half-price books, and I'm going to start reading those books very soon. I've been fortunate enough to purchase a second home in Anthem, Arizona, which is just north of Phoenix and north and west of Scottsdale. And my wife and I plan to spend many winters down there. And I've had the chance over the last few weeks to develop a few guiding philosophies or principles to show me the way in the next several years. And one of them is to embrace the world, to meet as many people as I can, meet new people, to seek new experiences, and to visit new places. Another is that I'm going to renew my efforts to volunteer for others. I've been very involved in a nonprofit for 25 years, and I'm going to continue that, but find other ventures to volunteer with. And just the other day, I was reading a book of quotations in a section called Age and Aging. And there were some quotes in there from very famous philosophers and knowledgeable people that I wanted to read you. There's just 3 of them. The first is by the well-known philosopher George Burns, who was married to Gracie Allen, as you might recall, and he said, "I was brought up to respect my elders, and now I don't have to respect anybody." Another famous philosopher, Phyllis Diller, you may have heard of. She said, "I'm at an age when my back goes out more than I do." And finally, and I didn't realize he had said this, but Maurice Chevalier said, "Old age isn't so bad when you consider the alternative." And all of us have heard that before. So I want to thank you for the honor and privilege of serving the city. and particularly serving the community, all of you. I'll always cherish my time spent with the city of Kenmore, with the community members, with the city council, with city managers, and with the staff. I'm going to miss you. And I wish you all the very best because you deserve it.
So Rod, my wife said to tell you to take some time and go play some golf. Let's take a few minutes and wish.
Do we have a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
So moved.
All second? All those in favor of passing the consent agenda, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Consent agenda is passed. Next up, business agenda. Item A, joint meeting with the Planning Commission on policy recommendations for the critical areas regulations and Shoreline Master Program. Debbie Bent, Community Development Director, and Lauri Anderson, Principal Planner. And the Planning Commission.
Good evening, Council. So while the Planning Commission is getting settled here, tonight we're here for the Planning Commission to present their recommendations on the critical area regulations and Shoreline Master Program recommendations. And I know this is actually what it looks like printed out. So this is, we know, a weighty packet that you've had to go through. And this represents over 12 months of work that the Planning Commission has done to be here tonight to present their recommendations. So they have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to bring you forward their recommendation. So before we get started with that, I would like to ask Lauri to just give a brief overview of the background of why we're doing this project, to talk a little bit about the public feedback we've had into this process. And then each of the Planning Commission members are going to highlight a topic for you, which was one of either a difficult question or a difficult policy issue that they tackled during this process. I'd also like to introduce Amy, who is our consultant with Shannon and Wilson, who has supported the Planning Commission through this project. Thank you.
Good evening, City Council and members of the Planning Commission. So I'm going to give a very short presentation. I couldn't begin to summarize everything that is included in your materials, but as you know, updating this Shoreline Master Program is a state requirement, and we have to submit our update by June 30th of this year. And the Department of Ecology has final approval over the regulations, so that's very different from our typical path. So the goal was to update the regulations using best available science and in response to changes in state law since we last did our amendments. And because the critical area rules in the shoreline are also subject to state review, and because it's better not to have different rules in the shoreline and outside of the shoreline, that's why the critical area amendments are also included with this package. The project started with a gap analysis, and I apologize, I had intended to send a link to that out to all of you, and I did not do that. So I will do that this week. But the gap analysis was prepared by the consultants, the team of consultants. They reviewed each section of our critical area rules and shoreline code, and then determined whether it conformed to best available science or and the state guidance. They had checklists, for example, from the Department of Ecology. And then they produced a large table that showed the code section, did we conform, and then suggestions for amendments. The Planning Commission reviewed that last summer, asked questions, and then once those questions were resolved, they began looking at the actual amendments to the code and to the comprehensive plan. So during the process, 2 forums were convened with state agencies and others interested in the topic. One was on the public agency and utility exception, that review process, and one was on docks and buffers on the Sammamish River. So our ecology shoreline planner has been following along. Sometimes she attended meetings, other times she watched the taped meeting. And she has followed the process since it started and has given us feedback. So we feel like we've received feedback from the shoreline aspect. As well, the Department of Ecology as a whole has reviewed different aspects, the flood regulations, for example, and the wetlands regulations. And so we have, and the Planning Commission have made changes based on recommendations from the Department of Ecology. So the Planning Commission held a public open house last fall and then a public hearing in March. We only had a couple of people testify at the public hearing, although we have a fairly extensive mailing list. Late last year, staff met with a representative of the Muckleshoot tribe and got some initial feedback from them, and also met with representatives of PERC in January. So the project has been advertised on the city's website, in the Bothell-Kenmore Reporter, in the Seattle Times. Again, I mentioned the mailing list, which we've maintained over the course of the project, and those folks have received every bit of information that went out to the Planning Commission. And then very importantly, our Development Services Department staff had been advising applicants for months that these changes were coming down the pike and to pay attention and offer feedback if they had issues, questions, or concerns. So the end result is the set of amendments before you tonight. Although it's a single chapter, Chapter 1855, which is critical areas, we've divided it into sections for ease of review so that if there were a particular topic you were interested in, it's just easier to find rather than wading through the whole document. Amendments to the shoreline sub-element, that's a part of the comprehensive plan, and that element is called out as an exception to the once per year rule, which is why we are looking at comprehensive plan amendments that you can adopt now for the shoreline. And then we have the shoreline regulation amendments. And there are some fairly significant changes in there, one of which is to align the shoreline rules with the table of uses in the zoning code. That's been a dream for years, so that there's not confusion when trying to translate between the 2 titles. So 2 sections have been extensively revised. The flood hazard area regulations, which one of the planning commissioners is going to talk about, and then a new section on groundwater susceptibility. I'm going to just briefly touch on that. Those new regulations allow the city to address concerns in the event, unlikely probably, that a business, commercial operation should come to Kenmore and somehow potentially have an adverse impact on groundwater. For example, if they wanted to do some sort of an injection well or they were handling hazardous substances. So those new regulations would not apply to typical projects, but give the city the ability to tackle issues if they should come up. So Exhibit A to your packet is a summary of the most significant changes. Exhibit C is frequently asked questions and goes into quite a bit more detail about some of the issues. B, again, the big section, is the amendments. And then Exhibit D is the best available science review related to the public agency and utility exception. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Planning Commission.
Well, thank you, Lauri, and thank you, council members, for having us today. We actually have a batting order here for our 6 sections, and we will start off with the PAUE with Commissioner Lutzis, who can also tell us what that acronym stands for.
Good evening, Council. My name is Nathan Lutzis, and I'm one of the commissioners on the Planning Commission. Tonight, I will briefly tell you about the PAUE. Now, the PAUE, or Public Agency and Utility Exception, has been revised recently to accurately lay out the process for public agencies and utilities to apply for an exception. This exception would only be granted for the extension and expansion of these facilities when it is considered that there is no feasible alternative option. Now, this would occur in a critical area where they might need to expand boundaries. Some of these examples include the updating of a city building, the extension of sewer lines or power lines or the expansion of an existing roadway. Now, again, this is only used when there is no other reasonable option. The process of applying is more rigorous, actually, compared to that of citizen applications for exceptions, and will not grant the city any special privileges with the PAUE over that of private citizens. Now, this was an issue that came up in our open houses. Citizens were concerned that this would kind of leave a back door for the city to maybe take advantage of and install a new kind of project that would normally be prevented. But this is not the case. This exception is in no way a shortcut for the city, but an updated structure to apply for an exception. Recommendations and amendments have been made based on suggestions by the Washington State Department of Commerce and by a meeting that was held back in the fall of 2018. Represented there were the city, specifically the Parks Planning Department, the King County Natural Resources and Parks, North Shore School District, Washington State Department of Commerce, Washington State Department of Ecology, and the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. All these agencies convened, met, and they discussed and made recommendations on how we should update our policies so that it is in the best interest of the community and the city. The main amendment that was made to this was the fact that this process would only be used for expansions of existing public facilities rather than new public facilities. So this is a change. In summary, this new PAUE is only an updated guidelines for the city applying for an extension of currently existing utilities, I'm sorry, not utilities, but currently existing facilities and utilities to update as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lutzis. Next, we have Commissioner Baker talking about wetlands.
Well, we're lucky in Kenmore to have some beautiful wetlands, and one of the main things that we worked on for this update was to look at how it's designated. So there was the ID of the wetlands and the different ways that they designate it. And really what this part of our ordinance or our comprehensive plan talks about is how to classify and rate these different wetlands. And the goal of doing this is to protect what we have and enhance it, but it's also to give us ways to do that stays within the boundaries of how the state ecology would like us to steward these lands. One of the elements that we worked on when we were going through this was looking at buffers. And again, it is being able to classify these areas, come up with having our regulations comply with state and federal ecology. Well, I guess it's the Corps of Engineers that actually comes out and looks at how the land is organized and how it has changed. The other thing that we reviewed was just the mitigation ratios and being able to adopt what the Department of Ecology would recommend in any kind of a compensatory type of mitigation. The difficult part of this element was looking at mitigation banking. And this is something that may come up as our urban area encroaches on these wetlands. And we also reviewed our in lieu fee programs, and we looked at some of the advanced mitigation basis that would look at the best science available to make sure that those areas are protected but are also useful to the urban core.
Thank you, Commissioner Baker. Next up is Commissioner Greathouse talking about habitats of importance.
Hi there. So first of all, to remind everybody what a habitat of importance is, those are habitat areas that serve a critical role in sustaining needed habitats and species for the functional integrity of the ecosystems, and which, if altered, may reduce the likelihood that the species will persist over the long term. So one of the changes during this edit was the addition of the pileated woodpecker breeding habitat. So that's new for us. Something else that is a little bit new is the bald eagle habitat being taken off the list of endangered species. So we're still covered there by the Federal Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, as well as folks who have eagle nests in their yards can self-certify and ensure that that area around the nest is being cared for. The other somewhat controversial item on the list was the great blue heron rookeries. There's been a change there from a 656-foot radius. Originally it was 900 and it was moved to 656-foot radius. In support of the rookeries, though, we've got an area between January 1st and July 31st where no land disturbing activity can occur. And also permits for activities within the heron rookery buffer shall not occur prior to approval of the habitat management plan by the city. So that ensures that the rookeries are cared for. Those are the main changes within that section.
Thank you. Our next section was supposed to be covered by one of our commissioners who couldn't make the meeting, Commissioner Vanderline. So we are going to have our senior planner, Lauri Anderson, discuss that one for us. Thank you, Lauri.
Right. So Mike Vanderland and I had been exchanging a series of emails. He had written his talking points, and then we had a little communication back and forth. So the good news is that I have his talking points, and so I'm just going to read down through them. He was unexpectedly called back to Olympia for his job. So he wanted to say, why is the regulation being proposed for new development in high landslide hazard areas? So, and he had some personal issues with this topic because he lives in an area of landslide hazard. He says, unregulated development within high landslide hazard areas entails significant risks to persons and property. Witness the OSO experience. The city of Kenmore includes several high landslide hazard areas, and we have new mapping, pretty good mapping that shows where those areas are. A significant portion of these hazard areas have already been developed or could be developed in the future. The Department of Ecology and a consultant engaged by the City of Kenmore provided the Planning Commission with the most current science related to the risks associated with residential development in geohazard areas and gave guidance in developing regulatory standards assessing these risks. So the Commission evaluated various options based on two core principles. First, any new regulatory standards must incorporate best available science. That's a requirement. And second, the Commission tried to achieve a reasonable balance between economic interests and public safety. The objective of the proposed new regulations, there are a couple of them, but one is to mitigate the economic impact of new development standards on property owners and developers, while protecting property owners, neighbors, and others from the potential threat to public safety inherent in any development within landslide hazard areas. So in high landslide hazard areas, expansion of existing structures would be permitted in the new rules, but you would have to provide a geotechnical report that demonstrates that the proposed expansion meets standards for safe development. Density available to developers under current zoning is maintained through an exception, which allows a reduction in lot sizes and clustering of projects away from the geohazard area. So you can move, I think the example was from 7,200 square foot minimum to 5,400 square foot minimum to cluster your lots away from a geohazard area if your site was not totally constrained. Development on those smaller lots would be designed to have the least impact on surrounding properties, i.e. street frontages and privacy consistent with abutting properties. And then new development on properties completely covered by high landslide hazard areas would be prohibited unless the landowner received a reasonable use exception. So the city would always, in a case where a property is entirely constrained with a critical area, allow for a reasonable use exception. That's a review process where you try to minimize the impact while still allowing a reasonable use of the property.
Thank you. Next up will be Commissioner Mulcair talking about the new Swamp Creek commercial.
Thanks. Good evening, Deputy Mayor and council members, and City Attorney Mr. Casaguma. Congratulations on your years of service and your retirement. It's been a pleasure to work with you. One section of the Shoreline Master Program amendments that I want to highlight this evening is the introduction of the new Swamp Creek Commercial Shoreline Environment designation. The purpose of the Swamp Creek Commercial Environment is to recognize existing and planned high-intensity commercial and high-density residential uses while protecting existing ecological functions and restoring ecological functions in areas that have been previously degraded. For reference, the Swamp Creek Commercial Environment is the area adjacent to Swamp Creek before it crosses under Highway 52 at 80th Avenue. It includes existing developments such as the retail center near Mr. T's Trophy Shop, the grocery outlet, as well as the multifamily housing that backs up to Swamp Creek along 80th Avenue. This area is currently designated as Urban Conservancy. The new designation more accurately reflects and accommodates existing and planned development and was encouraged by the Department of Ecology. From a policy perspective, water-oriented use is a priority over non-water-oriented uses. And for non-water-oriented uses, development projects must provide substantial improvement to the degraded buffer along Swamp Creek.
Thank you, colleagues. For that, I'll wrap this up with talking a little bit about the flood hazard areas section of our recommendation. So as we all know, it can rain a lot around here, and Kenmore has some low-lying areas along the lower reaches of Swamp Creek and the Sammamish River. And thus, even us non-hydrologists, I think, can understand we have some flood-prone areas in the city, especially along Swamp Creek. So I'll just highlight two main aspects of this particular section about flood hazard areas. So first, as Lauri sort of alluded to, it consolidates in one place the minimum development standards, both residential and non-residential, within flood hazard areas and frequently flooded areas. So those standards previously existed in two different sections. There are really no material changes to the standards themselves, and this version also takes out some old King County holdover designations. So second, I want to note that these revisions were reviewed by FEMA and the State Department of Ecology to make sure they comply with the National Flood Insurance Program, which they do. And that effectively means that Kenmore residents who are in these designated flood-prone areas are eligible for that insurance program. So overall, this section is designed to protect human lives, minimize public spending, limit damages to infrastructure, businesses, and fish and wildlife habitat, and protect areas with ecological value, among other benefits. So that's it for our sort of summary highlights of this very large package, and so I would open it up to the council. To questions, comments, thoughts?
Before I ask for questions, I just have a quick clarifying question for staff. So you bring this to us now. We need to have it approved by June 30th. What are you looking for? What are you hoping to get from the council tonight, and what are the next steps?
So what we would anticipate tonight is to have a general conversation, and if you already have questions that we could respond to, that would be helpful. We anticipate this will be on your agenda next Monday, and that would be a follow-up discussion where you would identify any concerns. And then we would hold a public hearing on June 10th. There's an additional amendment that we're going to be introducing next week that the Department of Ecology is supportive of, which would necessitate a public hearing. So June 10th, public hearing. Now, there's some room in there. If we are stuck on a particular topic, we can put another meeting, potentially 2 meetings in there, but that's the general goal.
Do we have questions? Councilmember Marshall.
Yes. Question and maybe a suggestion, if everybody else has questions also about everybody, maybe we should go according to Commissioner, if people have multiple questions as to one topic rather than skipping around or as to topic. And number one, also though, thank you to the Planning Commission for going through the work to get all this done. Very much appreciated.
Councilmember Shrevenick is next.
Yeah, my question is sort of how do you want questions? So that's
Yeah,
sort
I'm
of
not
the same
sure.
issue.
I'm not sure if we'll be able to really group them though effectively.
Yeah.
I think that might tie us up, frankly, more than just asking our questions. So, okay. So who has a Councilmember Marshall?
In that case, I have questions for just about everybody, very briefly.
Why don't you ask a couple of them and then we'll go around and you can come back to you.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. All right. So Commissioner Baker, and any staff who can address it also. Early on, I remember seeing a new definition of wetlands. I didn't see it in this iteration of stuff, or perhaps I missed it. Was a new definition still in this iteration of the proposed regulations?
Basically, these regulations are just coming in compliance with the state ecology and the federal easing, but staff might be able to address that better.
The definition of wetland did not change. The
Okay.
typing, the categorization of wetlands did change. So the features that might make it a more significant or a less significant wetland, and that affects the buffers. Those changed, but not the definition.
Okay, thank you. And then did we are we expecting to propose a wetlands banking program or mitigation banking program?
I don't think so. But the regulations are set up so that if we do need to do that, it's already in our regulations. And again, it's complying with King County and state.
Okay. And any brief description then of what a wetlands banking program would look like in terms of, I mean, just an example, how does it affect like a given property, and then how does it protect wetlands overall?
I can tackle that one. So what the city is most likely to do, and developments in the city are most likely to take advantage of, is perhaps mitigation banking programs established by others. The city is not likely to establish its own banking program just for a variety of reasons: scale of the property, space availability, management and administration, et cetera. But King County, for example, is working on developing some banks, mostly private developers that are in the mitigation banking field, or have been developing some banks. I think the closest one under development right now is in Redmond and Keller Farm. So if the city of Kenmore is in the service area of that bank, for example, then if a developer or a private property owner within the city needed to fill a wetland and needed a place to mitigate for it, they could purchase credits from that mitigation bank. So that's kind of one opportunity. And a mitigation bank, kind of the quick version of it, is it's already a developed wetland site that's available and has wetlands that can kind of effectively be sold to compensate at reduced mitigation ratios. So there's some advantages to applicants for doing that versus trying to cobble together their own mitigation on their own property or a neighbor's property. Another option that I think was brought up is in lieu fee. So King County already has an in lieu fee program, and similarly, if a developer was going to fill a wetland and is looking for a place to mitigate, they could purchase or contribute funds to King County's program, and then the county would take that money and put it into a project that has not yet been built. So mitigation banking is usually the mitigation is already built, and then you're kind of paying for that. Or an in lieu fee program, you're putting money in, and then they'll collect the funds and then implement a project. But
both of those are strategies that allow development to kind of contribute to mitigation that's at a much larger scale and provides a lot more bang for the buck, basically, than trying to piecemeal and do postage stamp mitigation around a community. So those two tools will be available to citizens in Kenmore once a mitigation bank is developed that actually you're in the service area of, but the in lieu fee program of the county is currently available.
Thanks.
Councilmember Curtis and Councilmember Smith.
So first, I want to thank you for all the work you've put in on this. I was part of the last time around, so I do remember how much work this was, but it saved me a lot of reading this time. I did have a question on the in lieu fee. So how's that actually chosen? It seems a bit random, because if you choose it too high, nobody will ever choose it, and if it's too low, everybody will say, aha, the easy way out.
Right. So the county has developed their in lieu fee program, and it's a cooperative effort with state and federal agencies. So there's before an applicant could even think about using that, there's already some very robust agreements in place between the sponsor or the developer of the projects and other agencies whose job it is to govern that and make sure that fees are reasonable and appropriate based on the actual cost of implementing projects and maintaining and monitoring those projects in perpetuity. So I've looked at some in lieu fee programs just for projects I've tried permitting myself, and depending on how you look at it, the cost is really high, but then if you factor in, hey, I've got to do 10 years of monitoring on this, and there's risks of failure and all that sort of stuff, then generally speaking, they try to hit the sweet spot where it makes economic sense. Because otherwise, yeah, you're not going to have any buyers, which is not a good thing, or people are just frivolously filling wetlands and, pushing them off to the in lieu fee program. But there's a number of safeguards in place. Like the Corps of Engineers, for example, is very, very strict and increasingly so on allowing wetland fill at all. So you have to meet that bar before you could even start thinking about where to mitigate.
Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Yes, I'd also like to thank you. This is really stimulating stuff, I'm sure, when you're getting home from work and getting home from school, Nathan, and you're jumping into this really exciting stuff. So thanks. It makes it a lot nicer to sit and have these great summaries and then kind of be able to back check where everything came from. I had a question, and unfortunately, Lauri, it's for you because Mike isn't here tonight, but it has to do with the geologically hazardous areas. And I guess a couple of things on this, because the technology is so far superior to whatever it's been in the past, and we really get to know how sensitive some of these steep slopes are. How is it reasonable to assume that anybody can get a reasonable use exception on a very hazardous, critically sloped site or very potentially unstable site?
I think ultimately we would be in the position of having to permit something, or it would be a taking of property, and we would be responsible, I assume, for acquiring that property. So we, in all our critical areas, have a reasonable use exception to prevent taking of private property. And when you go through that process, for example, we've seen it on wetland-covered properties, what you try to do is make the smallest reasonable impact to the site that you can. So you can't build a 3,000 square foot residence. Maybe your footprint is greatly reduced. And usually a single family residence is the standard for what is a reasonable use.
So if, I mean, it's just by the nature of how economics and land works that so many of the sites that are left to be built upon are highly sensitive and will be more so in the years ahead, as they're the ones that are left over. And so you used it as a flood as an example. I know when we've had to buy flood-prone properties in the past, we had to pay market rate as if they weren't in a flood zone. And so if we were to deny a reasonable use exception, do we have to pay market rate as if it was a buildable site?
I'm not aware of a case where we have denied a reasonable use exception. I don't know, this may be a question for Rod.
I can help with this question by saying the taking of property where a portion of it is constrained by, in this case, geologically hazardous areas, is fact dependent. To give an example, there is a case decided years ago by the Court of Appeals of Washington where a reasonable use was determined to be only a dock on a shoreline property as opposed to a small house. So in that, the court decided that a dock was appropriate because all of the neighboring parcels had only developed to the extent of a dock. And the only ones that had a house on the property were those that had significant uplands upon which a house could be built. And in that case, a septic system could also be installed. So it's fact dependent. And my guess is that with geologically hazardous areas, you're going to find more situations where nothing is allowed because geological hazards are not like wetlands. The entire property would be at risk if there was a landslide. So I just pointed out as some factors you need to think about.
So isn't it couldn't we assume that it's very likely in the near term we would see just a standard buildable lot, 7,600 square feet or 9,600 square feet, that is entirely in a zone that is very hazardous from a geological perspective? And then I'm trying to understand if we're going to just automatically give them a permit through that reasonable use, or find some, even if it's a smaller footprint, it just, a lot of those lots, they sell for very significantly below market rate, and the reason they do is because they have very little utility from a buildable standpoint. I feel like it's not in our communities necessarily our best interest to allow that to happen. And I realize we can't just go and take land, and I wouldn't want to, but on the same hand, I also wouldn't want to deal with the potential problems that we may have if in 20 years from now we have 30 days of rain and then an earthquake, and what happens. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to look ahead towards, because I see this becoming more and more of an issue as land is so expensive.
I will say that actually many of the lots inside the city's high landslide hazard areas are already developed. So that's one thing, which is why the issue of expansion with a geotech report is required. The basic standard is you can't develop in a high landslide hazard area. So that's where we start. And then if you say, well, the whole thing is a high landslide hazard area, then you would go through the steps of getting a geotechnical report to say, how could you safely develop on this property? What are the mitigating factors that would allow you to develop? And then again, we get back to this test of what is allowing reasonable development. I don't know how through the regulations you can go beyond that.
Okay. No, that's reasonable.
We need to have the regulation in place, a reasonable exception opportunity, but under certain facts, I can see where there might not be any development.
Okay.
And the takings cost would be a lot less, for example, if somebody just bought the property after the designation had been put on the property than someone who's had the property years before the designations were even in effect. So there's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of factors we would have to take into account, but it's preferable for the city to have that reasonable use exception opportunity.
Okay, and if I mind another, because it has to do with the same issue, on the clustering, when it reduces the minimum site size to 5,400 square feet, does that alter setbacks at all either, or is it strictly the individual site size?
It's just the lot sizes that are reduced, and it doesn't change the density either. So it just allows you, hopefully, to fit in what the normal number of lots that you might have been able to achieve in the area that's not constrained.
So if you had a 25, let's say a 25,000 square foot site, and under the current zoning, let's say it was 72 or I guess R6. So let's say you could have 3 buildable sites. If you had like 3/4 of that area covered with a sensitive area, critical areas, you wouldn't necessarily say you're automatically allowed to go down to 5,400 and still have 3 lots? Or is that, would you still do that, or would you actually say, no, it's 5,400, but we're actually only going to allow 2?
No, it would be the whole property that you would base it on.
Okay.
But again, depending on how much acreage you had outside the geologically hazardous area, you would still have to meet that 5,400 lot size. We chose 5,400 because most of the areas that are constrained by geologically hazardous areas are currently zoned R4, and so we went to the minimum lot size for the R6, which is the typical Kenmore single-family zoning, to go to that minimum lot size. So we were kind of balancing what surrounding development is likely to be with the fact that they have this reduced zoning because of the geologically hazardous area.
Okay.
That was the motivation.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Danuski.
Thank you for all of your work. It's been a long project for you. I had a question on the nominations for Habitat of Importance. Can people nominate like their own property as a habitat of importance, or is it just for public areas?
There's a process that you go through to nominate, and it's a little more extensive than just saying, I want my backyard to be a habitat. I'll see if I can find it quickly. So.
But it can be on private property.
Oh, yes, it definitely can be on private property.
I thought I read it that way. And then,
Yeah.
so what happens, I guess my real question on that, because it explained it a little bit in there, but what happens when the title transfers? Does that Habitat of Importance stay with the title? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
That was really my question on that part. I'll come back.
Councilmember Shrubnik.
I have a few. I can tag on to Councilmember Danusi's question about habitats. I was also curious how the species are nominated. It looked like maybe the woodpecker came on due to a student research project, and so that made me curious about the whole process. So that was one. And then the other question is, since I did look at the gap analysis, is there maybe just sort of a summary of points where the Planning Commission diverged from the gap analysis, if any? I would be curious about that. I have some other questions too, but I'll wait.
So for the species that we included in the list as proposed right now, those are the ones already designated by the State Department of Fish and Wildlife as priority species. And so we looked at Fish and Wildlife's online mapping resource to see what's known, documented in the city. And there's significant pileated woodpecker habitat areas already mapped in the city, and so that was kind of a natural. There weren't too many other species-specific ones, so I think there's other habitats like wetlands and that sort of thing. We know about the great blue heron, rookery already, so that was the only one that rose to the top and needed to be added. And then, as I think someone mentioned earlier, the bald eagle dropped off of the list because it's no longer federally listed or a state priority species. But there are other protections in place, and we've kept some of those incorporated into the regulations. And as far as the divergent question, there was some really good discussion, I recall, about the great blue herons, whether or not and how to include the pileated woodpecker in the biodiversity area corridor, I think, as well. But I think in the end, everybody moved forward with what was recommended in the gap analysis report, as I can recall.
And that was a broader question, not just about the habitat piece. I mean, it was just sort of
general
across
divergences.
if there were areas where the Planning Commission diverged.
I don't think so. I have to look at each one individually, but I think that is the recommendations are based on best available science for the most part, with a few other suggestions based on, I think this would make it work better in the city, or, you know, something like that, that I think this code reflects pretty closely the gap analysis recommendations.
Thank you.
Councilmember Marshall.
Okay, and for Commissioner Lutzis on the POWI, does that represent, at least, and you touched on a little bit on it earlier, does that represent something of a value judgment, or had you looked in any of the literature or to staff as to whether that public purpose of the utility, and as I can understand, that can include a park, whether that is being weighed somewhat against the environmental preservation values?
Well, in a sense, it's usually implemented when there's no other feasible option, and it's for more of a community benefit and the benefit for the citizens. That's why it includes such things as roadways, sewer lines, power lines, utilities, and other things that benefit the public in a sense where it can't be mitigated anywhere else. And is there anything else you'd like to add on?
The park question, too.
Yeah, I might just add that in the discussion of the science paper, which is Exhibit D, there's a really good discussion about how for public agencies and public utilities, there's always this question of balance, that public agencies and utility companies have an obligation to serve the public. And sometimes there are only certain places where things can go. And if that is the case, then you are able to balance the environmental protections with other legal obligations to serve the public and educate our children and that kind of thing. So when we held the forum last September, we started out by saying, where are these things? Why is there a need for this? And the school district, for example, said, okay, so we want to expand a facility, and there's a wetland and a large buffer on our property, and if we followed these rules strictly, we might be having to tear out our ball fields, or we couldn't expand our gym in a certain direction. We would, in other cases, maybe there would be a parking issue. So these agencies with pre-existing facilities may have a site that's constrained by critical areas, and so how do you treat that? Well, the idea of the PAUE, which again is now targeted only for existing facilities or linear transportation or utility facilities, the point is to follow a strict set of criteria, and I agree with Commissioner Lutzis that the criteria for this activity are more restrictive than for any private applicant. And so you have to meet the same tests, you have to go through the same mitigation sequencing, you have to do all of those things so that you're not damaging the critical area functions and values, but you are able then to proceed with this public project.
And did it include parks?
It does include
Right.
parks, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councilmember Smith.
I have a question on the noticing on title for, it deals with the critical or critical areas and or buffers when construction happens in there. My question is, it says, it starts off and it says, in order to inform subsequent purchasers of real property. Does it also serve to protect the city from a liability standpoint if we're making exceptions to allow things to happen in the critical areas? Or is it solely for the purpose of notifying future buyers?
I don't remember that those easements, which are shown on the title, that those talk about city liability. I don't recall that that is the case, but I haven't specifically looked at that.
From the city attorney's perspective, is that something that you ever see? Is it necessary, or is it just a given within that noticing on the title in the first place?
Is your question whether
My question,
Is
I'll
it
be
necessary to
specific.
put them on the title?
Yeah,
Because if it isn't, then, if it is, then maybe the city is defaming the title, so to speak?
No, actually, I just want to know that if there is a catastrophic event that causes significant real property damage in areas where we granted permits and allowed construction, do we have a liability risk? Because even if it's noticed on title,
No.
we don't.
There's no additional liability if we approve a permit application for a filling of a wetland, you're saying, for example. Is that an example?
Yeah, I mean, I'm referring to, this, it just talks, it says, we'd notice on any property containing a critical area or buffer on which a development proposal is submitted. And at that point, it's noticed on title. I'm just trying to understand how that factors in long-term.
Long-term. Well, because I'm not sure of the question, but if it's on the title, then that is notification to subsequent owners that there's a possibility of a critical areas restriction. And that is good for the city to put people on notice that's a possibility.
Okay, and I agree with that completely. I'm
Okay.
just understanding, I just want to make sure that we, as a city, don't incur, or I shouldn't say don't incur, that we fall under those customary liability
Oh, okay.
exceptions.
Yeah,
when
if the
title
question is whether we incur liability solely from the fact that we put a notice on the title, the answer is no. Suppose there could be a situation where the notice is on the title, but that restriction really never existed. So that's a negligence question, and we could perhaps have liability if that is not a restriction, but I can't imagine that would happen very often.
Okay, well, the reason I even bring it up is because there was something very similar to this that we had to deal with at the city level in the not-so-distant past.
Yes.
And
It
so
was a little it was a different situation, yes.
It was different,
Mhm.
okay. Okay.
That was something like a lien or an encumbrance, is that right? It was something that the city created, not a situation that was on the ground, is my recollection. So that'd be different.
Okay. I guess my whole point of all of that is I just want to make sure if we're allowing construction to happen in critical areas that we're not also extending our liability exposure.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Most of my remaining questions are regarding the shoreline use table. I've got a couple of little ones, though, other than that. So in the geohazard zone, it looked like non-vehicular trails are allowed. Is that including like mountain bike trails? It was a little unclear. I mean, that was a term that wasn't used elsewhere. So.
Right, I think that the idea was that non-vehicular could be, I suppose, bike or
Right.
pedestrian.
And we wouldn't worry about
Well, bike we
that
might
in-
worry about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why I was curious why we
Yeah. In the-
specifically said that rather than pedestrian trail.
Yeah, so that may be something that you would want to look at.
Okay.
Do you have a site for that by any
Yeah,
chance?
it's
I'll find it,
page 8
but-
of the geo section.
Thank you.
And then my other little one was, and I'm guessing I'm reading this wrong, but in the map that shows the various waterfront zones, categories, it looked like Squires Landing Park is now within the natural area. I'm hoping I'm reading that wrong. Is that?
So Squires Landing has always been in the natural area, and the
Okay.
change on the map this time around is to move those areas of more activity into urban conservancy, rather than leaving them in the natural environment.
Okay, so the Squires Park part is now in, okay, that's the piece that,
Right.
okay, because that makes a big difference in the table. Okay. And then I guess I just had a set of questions, maybe they could be encapsulated. I understand that in the table, you're now including all of the various possible uses that we have in our other parts of the comp plan. But then we run into things like adult entertainment. Do we really want that on the waterfront or in the Swamp Creek commercial areas? I mean, it just seemed, and they're permitted, not even conditional. And, you know, there were others like that that were just sort of surprising.
Right, so the shoreline table overlays the zoning. And if something is permitted in the shoreline, it has to also be permitted by the
Okay.
underlying zoning.
That's what I thought I was missing.
So
Okay.
this,
Okay,
so
that
this
explains
chart
it.
exactly mimics the uses. And then if it's permitted in one shoreline environment, then it, again, has to conform to the underlying zoning. So we're not permitting anything new here that wouldn't be permitted by the
The underlying
zoning.
zoning. Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Councilmember Curtis?
Mine is just a minor point on the Blue Heron buffer. So it's 656 feet. And I know we're relying on best available science. It's really difficult for me to believe best available science would have come to that precise footage. Can you just give me some insight in how that number came out?
I don't have the actual study in front of me, but there's a State Department of Fish and Wildlife produces these rather concise kind of recommendations for a lot of individual species. And in one of those studies for the pileated woodpecker, that magic number is now 656, or for the heron. And I can go back and look and have the answer more clearly for you next time, but I'm speculating that maybe it's a conversion from meters, because a lot of these scientific studies are in meters, so maybe that's 1,000 meters, or I'm not good at math, but I'll look into it. But that is the exact number that was included in the best available science, the most available, best available science.
Councilor Marshall?
And for Commissioner Mulcair, it's this new Swamp Creek Commercial Zone, is it called? Shoreline Environmental, okay, thank you. So that comprises the area of like Kenmore Square, isn't that the name of the development? Okay. And it doesn't contemplate the area a little bit north of it?
It actually does go quite a bit north as well. This was our evening of Google Earth analysis to define the boundaries or to examine the boundaries, both with what was recommended by Department of Ecology and our consultants as well. And we had to make some adjustments to the contours of that to reflect the path of Swamp Creek as well as existing developments.
And isn't it mainly residential right now, though, north of the?
North of Swamp Creek, I would say yes, mostly residential, if not zoned residential, and then
Right, so the Swamp Creek designation picks up only that commercial area. We followed also the line of the underlying commercial zoning. So the area north that's residential is Urban Conservancy. Right. And is not in Swamp Creek Commercial. It has a different designation.
Okay.
To the north.
And then the main concentrated residential would be the apartment complex right on the creek. It's on the east, or on the west side of 80th, is that right? The apartment complex, is that in the
Yeah, I don't
zone?
think, I think that's
No.
Swamp Creek Commercial.
Okay.
Is not Swamp
Not.
Creek Commercial.
Oh, okay.
So it follows down the south side of the creek to 522. It picks up the Mr. T's Trophy piece, and then it picks up the piece across the street, which I believe is a gas station.
Okay. All right. And I had one more thought related to that, was that, at least I heard the general idea was with any expansion, there was to be mitigation or enhancement of Swamp Creek shoreline or buffer. Is that right, in a general sense?
for non-water-oriented use development, there would be a requirement of restoration for previously degraded shoreline.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for all the work you've put into this. You've given us a lot to think about. This is example number one of how the city wouldn't be able to function without the Planning Commission. So thank you for all of the
Thank you.
pre-digesting you've done on this for us. I really appreciate it. Sounds like we'll be coming back to this again next week. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could I just add one thing?
Of course.
If as council is reviewing the materials, if you have questions, feel free to email those forward to staff so that we can try to be ready for Monday, if possible.
All right, thank you. Next up, community survey results for the Park Recreation and Open Space Plan Update. Debbie Bent, Community Development Director, and Maureen Colaizi, Park Project Manager, and I apologize if I bungled that. All right.
Everything important in life should fit on a 3x5 card.
Good evening, Council, again. So I'd like to introduce Maureen Colaizi, who's our Parks Project Manager, and Ryan Murray with the ETC Institute, who's been our consultant on this project. So we're here tonight to present you the survey results for the community survey that we started out, which we're going to use as we update the Park Recreation and Open Space Plan. So we sent out a survey to many residents in the community. It's a randomized, statistically valid survey. And Ryan is here this evening to present the results. So once we've pulled up that PowerPoint presentation, I think without further ado, given the lateness of the hour, I'm going to let Ryan dive right into his presentation.
On push.
There we go.
Is that better?
That's better.
Everybody can hear me? All right. I tend to stray away from microphones, so if I'm straying, please let me know. So as Debbie mentioned, I'm with ETC Institute. We are a national leader in market research for government organizations. We conduct statistically valid surveys all over the country. We also work heavily in transit, so we've done a lot of work for King County Metro and the ferry service here, so we're very familiar with the area and the region. We're happy to be here, so I appreciate everybody's time tonight. It's a small group, so feel free to stop me if you have any questions, and I'll also take questions at the end. I have a copy of the report here, so I'll do my best to answer what we can and follow up via email. ETC Institute was founded in 1982 by Dr. Elaine Tatham. Her son, Christopher Tatham, is currently our CEO, and she is acting as president. It's a great family business. I've worked there since I was 16, so I've been there about 17 years now. We specialize in the design and administration of surveys, and particularly market research for government organizations. We do specialize in Parks and Recreation. We've been called the gold standard of Parks and Recreation surveys. We work heavily with a number of consultants, and we're actually working with Kent, Washington right now, which I believe is just south of the lake here. We also do business employee surveys, and we conduct focus groups. And really the focus of our work is to not only be implementation oriented, but to also combat special interest groups. We deal with that particularly when it comes to Parks and Recreation, and sometimes groups can hijack meetings or discussions, and they're smaller groups, and they seem to have a very large voice in the community. And the survey that we do typically kind of filters out the white noise and gets straight to the root of really what the community as a whole needs or desires. The purpose of your survey was administered as the city begins to update its Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan. And as I mentioned earlier, we objectively assess the leisure and recreation needs of the community, and that's really what the survey is great at doing. And beyond that, the surveys are designed to, with our analysis tools, to help establish priorities for the future improvement of parks and facilities, particularly recreation programming and facilities in the community that we work in. Just a little bit about the methodology. It was a 6-page survey. It takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes to complete, depending on how thoughtful your response is. It was the first survey we've conducted for the city of Kenmore, and we administer it with a combination methodology, mail, online, and phone. And what that means is that we mail a survey to a random sample of households selected from the community at large. About 7 to 10 days after those surveys arrive in the mail, we'll then send a follow-up email to all the households who received the survey in the mail. Those respondents are then prompted via the email to either take the survey online or fill out and return their paper survey, and any needed follow-up is done by phone after that. We had a sample size goal of 400, which would have provided a margin of error of about 4.9% at the 95% level of confidence. However, the community here is obviously very thoughtful, and we'll get into that when we get into some of the actual results. And we collected nearly 600 surveys, 578. So when we sample a community like yours, we've been doing this for a long time. We understand how to sample, what racial groups, what age groups, and how to sample the community. So when we do this, we expect to get maybe plus or minus 10 or 20 surveys from our goal. When a community comes out and almost, doubles our goal in that sense, it says a lot about the community and how thoughtful the responses are here. So we had a margin of error of about 4% at the 95% level of confidence, which means that if we were to complete the survey 100 more times, 95% of the time we're going to get basically the same results within this margin of error. One of our analysis tools is called our priority investment ratings. There was 2 large questions on the survey instrument, took up pretty much 2 full pages, one for facilities, one for programs. Basically the priority investment tool is an objective tool for evaluating the importance and unmet need for each one of these facilities and programs. And we use this tool to help leaders like yourself understand and prioritize improvements in the community. And what this is basically saying, and we'll get into this in just a moment, but the items that rate the highest, or the high priority items in these lists, are technically the items that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck or have the greatest impact on the largest number of households in the community. And we'll get into that in just a moment. We also geocoded all of the responses. So we geocode our sample before we mail, and then we geocode again once we get the sample back. We do that just to make sure that we have a representative sample of respondents from throughout the community, and that we don't need to oversample or sample again any regions of the community. And you notice there are a couple blank spots here, but those are usually commercial areas or areas that are void of homes. So what we saw here is a really good representative sample of responses from throughout the community, so we have no worries geographically. If we talk about some of our major findings, we found that, again, Kenmore is a very thoughtful community. Most respondents also indicated that they're very satisfied with the parks and recreation offerings in the community. And not only that, they're also fairly satisfied with the opportunities to participate in any kind of recreation programs within the city. And I understand that the city of Kenmore does not necessarily provide programs, but folks are still relatively satisfied with the offerings that they find within your city. Over half of respondents indicated they're satisfied with the number of recreation opportunities. About half gave positive ratings when asked to rate the quality of recreation programs. Nearly 80% are satisfied with the number of city-owned parks and recreation facilities. So just to kind of put that in perspective, 8 out of 10 folks are satisfied. It's really rare that you're going to get 10 people in a room, 8 are satisfied with something. So that's an extremely high number. And then 91% of folks who actually visited a facility rated the condition of a park or facility as either excellent or good. So generally, people in Kenmore are very satisfied with their parks and recreation offerings here. When I was talking about the priorities for investment, we did find some high priorities. For the facility side, most of these are pretty standard from communities throughout the United States. Most of them well, 3 of them there are indoor facilities. The others are more centered around trails. And if we think about it in other terms, these are all programs or facilities that regardless of age or ability, you're most likely going to be able to use or attend these types of programs and facilities. Off-leash dog parks is another one that's fairly common throughout the United States for kind of raising to the top here. And a community recreation center is also one of those. Anytime an indoor swimming pool or aquatic center is listed on this list, it typically rises to the top unless one's recently been built in the community or surrounding area within the last few months. But typically these parks and recreation surveys, we do find that rising to the top. It's always a desire for the community. And we'll kind of get into that as we kind of go into past the priorities and more into the support. When it comes to programs and activities, we found a little bit more of a custom response here. Adult fitness and wellness programs is one that always kind of comes up at the top. Folks are oftentimes willing to indicate that they have a need for that program. However, when we talk about nature and environmental education programs, that's something that rarely will come to the top, and it's just kind of another hint at how thoughtful the residents of Kenmore were when responding to the survey. Same with cultural events and programmings, and then the adult painting, arts, and sculpturing classes. So those were all kind of 3 things that kind of caught me off guard, something that I wouldn't have maybe thought would have been a priority when starting this project. So what we'll talk about next is just facility use and awareness and some of the ratings that had to go with that. We asked a wide variety of questions, and I'm just going to kind of call out some of the major topics and some of the major themes here. When asked to check all of the City of Kenmore Parks and Recreation facilities that you're aware of, we had very high awareness rates with really the top 5 items here. The top 3 here are the most regularly visited facilities. There are a few facilities towards the bottom of the list, like Twin Springs Park and Linwood Park, that had relatively low levels of awareness, but it seems like the big ones had high levels of awareness and usage. We asked respondents to indicate how frequently they visit parks and recreation facilities in the city. We had about 2/3 of respondents indicate they're visiting at least monthly or weekly, which is really high usage rates. Maybe not for the region, but nationally, when we look at this number, this is a really high number. 5% are visiting daily, and about a quarter or so, 20%, 1 in 5, visit quarterly. We also asked respondents to rate the physical condition of the parks and recreation facilities they visited, and again, about 90% of folks are satisfied. So again, pulling 10 people into a room, getting 9 to agree on something is very difficult in the line of work that I do. So this is always a good sign, and less than 1% of folks were dissatisfied or gave a poor rating to the facilities. We also asked respondents to indicate all of the organizations that members use for parks and recreation and cultural programs in facilities and activities. We noticed that City of Kenmore is number 4 on the list. We had about half of folks indicate the City of Kenmore is one of the organizations that they use. Surrounding cities just came out just barely on top of that, but most folks seem to be using state parks, King County parks, neighboring communities, and then the City of Kenmore. So high usage rates of federally or state or county subsidized programs and facilities and activities. What we found is that when we asked folks to indicate what type of facility they're using from other providers, not Kenmore, we found that the County Burke-Gilman Trail and then the St. Edward State Park were significantly more used than any of the other items listed. Here's kind of when we get into the bulk of the analysis. This was a multi-part question. I don't know if anybody received the survey in the mail. But these are in-depth questions. It takes a lot to kind of get through them. And when we find results like you all had, we found that people in Kenmore took their time to really do this right. We first asked respondents to indicate whether or not someone in their household had a need for each of the following facilities. The percentage here just represents the number of respondents who indicated they had a need. In order to kind of put this into perspective, we estimated based on census numbers that there's approximately 9,000 homes in the City of Kenmore, or 9,000 households. So we kind of quantify this with percentages and then number of households, and we found that approximately 6,500 of the 9,000 households had a need for nature trails. And so we'll list all these, and we'll use that to formulate our priority investment rating. Every respondent that indicated yes to having a need for the facility was asked to indicate how well their needs being met on a 4-point scale. We determined that fully met and mostly met ratings indicate, and those are listed in blue, those indicate that the household's needs for that facility are being mostly or fully met, which we're not concerned about. So folks have a need that's being met by some organization within the community. The red and the yellow is where we concern ourselves a little bit more. So we take those folks that indicated yes, we ask them how well their needs are being met, and we estimate the number of households in the community who have an unmet need for each of the facilities. As we see there, a large number of households, approximately 5,000 of the 9,000 in the community, have an unmet need for indoor swimming pools and aquatic centers, and that's why we saw that rise to the top of that list. It's just a current facility that's not being offered to residents in Kenmore, or at least most folks don't think that they're being offered that facility regularly or adequately. We then kind of, through our research, we found that respondents tend to over-quantify their need for items. They tend to over-quantify their desire or usage of programs and facilities. So we've developed kind of a way of counteracting that and asking residents to pinpoint the 4 most important items to their household. We did this both for facilities and for programs, and we'll get into programs in just a moment. But what we find is that we can cut through some of the weeds and the white noise when we ask importance. So most households are willing to admit, yes, I have a need for almost all the facilities on the list. But when we kind of counteract that, which ones are most important, we really filter things out. And as you can see, the top 4 items there are the ones that really stand out. So based on all that, we weigh the importance, the unmet need, and we get our priority investment rating. And in the report, there's a full methodology breakdown on this, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to go over it further. But what we found is that those items at the top of the list, those 7 items, are the most important. And again, when we say that, we're not minimizing, outdoor pickleball courts or playgrounds or skateboarding areas. We're not saying that those things should be defunded. We're not saying that they're not important to the community. What we're saying is that the implementation, development of, or improvement of the facilities at the top of this list will have the greatest impact on the largest number of households based on the current unmet need in the community. And that's how the programs list will also work. So like I said, we did this for both facilities and programs. I'll kind of skim through these next slides. What we found here again, and as I mentioned earlier, adult fitness and wellness programs is one of those items that comes to the top of the list in nearly every community that we survey. This was also holding true here. When we asked importance, or excuse me, the unmet need and the fully needs met question, we found that most folks are indicating that their needs are either partly or only not met by the community right now. And this again is not framed in the sense of if the city of Kenmore is meeting your need, just whether or not your needs are being met in the community currently. And that's why we have so much yellow and red here. We also, found out the level of unmet need, and we had that kind of stand out at the top here. But then we had some of the others in nature, environmental education programs, cultural events, and adult painting, arts, and sculpturing classes. Those kind of also stood out towards the top, along with water fitness programs. And then again, in the importance, the adult fitness and wellness programs were also the most important item, which, because of all that, they rose to the top of the priorities list. Along with nature environmental education programs, culture events, community events, programs for adults 50 plus, and that adult painting, arts, and sculpturing classes. So again, not to say that inclusive or adaptive recreation programs are not important or should not be funded or should not be resourced in the community. It's just fewer number of households could potentially have a need for that type of program. Every survey was taken by an adult, so that's also kind of another reason that the adult fitness and wellness programs stand out at the top. Each respondent was an adult over the age of 18. So just to kind of put a little perspective on this is that we're not saying that any of these things are less or more important than the others. All we're saying is that in order to kind of fix the need or to alleviate the unmet need in the community, those are the items that will likely do that. So we also asked whether or not respondents were supportive of taking particular actions, and we framed this in a sense of how supportive would you be of the city of Kenmore potentially taking an action in the future to improve the parks and recreation offered in the community. What we found is that acquiring Shoreline for water and beach access was by far the most important item, and here it received a high level of support. It received a high level of support with developing multi-purpose paths and trails in parks. And as you noticed in the priorities for facilities, that was also one of the top items. And what we find nationally is that folks are not so concerned about the development of new trails or the upkeep of trails. They're more concerned about the connectivity and how these trails are connecting their communities and how the parks within the communities are connected through these trails. And it's more of a system item rather than making sure my trail is paved or well kept. And we find that everywhere we do these studies. I highlighted 4 items with red arrows up there. I wanted to kind of just go through some of the maps so you guys, when you look at that appendix, kind of have a basis for what we're looking at. So I took a few from all over the place. Acquiring shorelines, like I said, was one of the most important items, received very high levels of support, all the way down to developing skateboarding areas, which received the lowest level of support and the highest level of negative support, or folks indicating they're not supportive. The legend is not on these maps, but it is in your appendix. The dark blue areas indicate high levels of support or very supportive responses based on census block group. We've merged and aggregated these data and come up with this blocking system. There is a small portion of town there that is light blue. That is just somewhat supportive responses as an average. For level of support for developing a new regional indoor community aquatic center, we saw one group of the community indicate they're neutral for that. One group is very supportive, and then most of the community somewhat supportive for that item. Here we see a little bit more neutral, but overall the community seems to be at least somewhat supportive of developing an off-leash dog area. Developing an at-grade water play area. Again, some of the areas of the community are neutral, maybe areas that are closer to another community that has one of these features. But for the most part, everybody's very supportive or somewhat supportive. And then, level of support for developing skateboarding areas. That was the item that received the lowest level of support, the highest level of not supportive answers. And we see 2 areas in particular are not supportive of this area. Most of the answers averaged out to a neutral rating, and then 2 areas were somewhat supportive. So as you look through that appendix, that's kind of how we review this, and you can get an idea of if you were to take the priority investment rating and implement it into your community, the maps could help you kind of delve into where this data is coming from, where the response is coming from, and help maybe implant some of those improvements into particular areas of town.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How statistically significant, though, or how accurate would you say you are when you're getting down to these blocks? So, because at this point, your sample sizes are shrinking.
Yes.
How representative or how reliable would a map like this actually be?
The margin of error on most of these block groups are relatively high. Yeah, there were almost 600 respondents. When we take the block groups, there's probably 18 or 20 of them there.
Yeah.
So when you're doing that, it's double-digit margin of error.
Okay.
But the maps are not necessarily a tool that we should be using to base all of our planning on, but they should be a tool just to give us a visual aid as to what maybe areas of town have a greater need than another. All the priority investment rating questions were mapped as well, so the levels of unmet need throughout the community are there. And those are really helpful in determining priorities for not particularly programs, but more so for facilities and where maybe facilities are lacking in the community. So you're right. We did deliver a geocoded database. So everything is geocoded to the block level to remain some sense of anonymity. But you can play with that database and merge these in a more meaningful way for the community. And we could even recreate the maps if there were council districts or 4 areas of town, and that would provide a much smaller margin of error. So I thank you for bringing that up, and that is true. So again, we like to quantify not only how supportive folks are of items or how much they need things or how satisfied they are with something, but we also want to make sure we understand the importance, and we ask again respondents to choose the 3 most important items or the 3 most important actions from the previous question that are most important to their household. And again, far and away, acquiring shoreline for water and beach access is that item. And as we noticed in the map, although Deputy Mayor pointed out maybe the flaw in that map, the whole map was for the most part dark blue or very supportive. So you could say with a certain degree of certainty that the whole community would be supportive of acquiring additional shoreline for water and beach access. Developing a new regional indoor community aquatic center, although important to respondents, received significantly less support. And I'll just run back to that chart real fast. As we see here, it's that first red arrow. It did receive over 50% of very supportive and somewhat supportive responses, but it did receive a significant level of not supportive, almost 1 in 5, and same with not sure. What we do at ETC Institute when we help folks on voter referendums is that we take the very supportive and we say if it came to a vote, the very supportive group would always vote yes. The somewhat supportive, about 3/4 or 2/3 of those would likely vote yes. And the not sures would kind of fall into that other third or quarter group from the somewhat supportive, and then the not supportive group is likely the group you won't be able to sway for any particular number of reasons. But what we found is that the shoreline item is very important to the community, received a high level of support. Some of these other items, although important to most individuals who took the survey, didn't receive as higher levels of support as we would have maybe hoped. Just to kind of run through some of the additional findings, just to show, how the community is reacting. Over half of respondents indicated, 53% of respondents indicated that they've participated in at least one community event in the past year. Of those, about 60% attended the 4th of July fireworks, and about 57% attended the summer concert series. Some of the other items on the list received relatively low levels of attendance, as I'm sure everybody in the community is aware of how those events work. We asked respondents to indicate what features are important to their parks, and then we did another follow-up question, a most important question, asking them to rank which features are most important to be added or improved in Kenmore. And I wanted to bring up this slide in particularly, is that anytime we see restrooms at the top of these lists, it's a healthy or thriving community. And the reason I say that is that we find communities that are constantly asking for more playgrounds or better kept fields or other amenities that are just commonplace in communities like yours. And when folks are more interested in improving restrooms in your parks than any other thing, it's a thriving community. It's a community that's taking care of their amenities and their resources, and it's something that everybody should be proud of. And I know it's kind of an odd thing to say, but whenever we see almost half of folks indicate that the most important improvement to your park should be in the restrooms, that's always it's a great sign. Walking paths, again, not so much about maintaining, but improving their connectivity is likely the source of this response here. And then this is something that we've been working on over the last few years, kind of developing our benchmarking on this. What we find is that communities who are more they're more focused on getting their information from word of mouth or family or friends are typically less inclined to participate. And I know that the city of Kenmore does not, offer many programs. However, nearly 60% of respondents indicated word of mouth is their primary source of information. In communities that answer this way, participation rates are relatively low in programs. The City of Kenmore printed newsletter is the second most used source of information on this list, and that's something that should be maintained and kept up and promoted in the community as the community grows and expands their parks and recreation offerings. That's something that's going to be key to ensuring participation and usage of facilities remains high, and then beyond that, satisfaction is going to remain high because you're staying in communication with the community in general. That's something that I always like to ask. Sometimes we ask a follow-up to this question. But word of mouth is always one of those things that we just find in communities that lack in participation rates. And in summary, these are my major findings from the beginning. Again, Kenmore is receiving excellent participation rates, excellent satisfaction rates. Everybody should be really proud of the facilities that are offered. I know that there's a lot of community development and a lot of partnering with other organizations to offer programs within the city, and that's all going phenomenally. People in Kenmore are relatively satisfied with all of the recreation offerings that they're being offered here, and just being here just for this evening, it sounds like a wonderful place to live, not only for some of the environmental work that you guys are doing, but most certainly the parks and recreation results here are something to be really proud about, especially when you kind of compare them to some of our national benchmarks. So, yeah.
I'll let you finish.
Yeah, that was it.
Councilmember Curtis.
Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you for the report.
Yeah,
I'm
thank you.
glad that this was like a follow-up of something we've done before. I love data.
Great.
But I'm sometimes a little suspicious
Yeah.
of the data as well.
Yeah, you should be.
And so I had three high-level concerns. One was the terminology that's used. So when you use terminology like needs and unmet needs, it sets a certain expectation as opposed to what do people actually want. So if I have a list on my fridge, it says, what am I going to get at Safeway? I really need that because it's like gone or about to be gone. Whereas if I get a catalog and I go flipping through it and I say, whoa, man, that fishing gear looks really good, I could order some of that. It feels like that's what this is. So out of these 20 things that you list for people, if you just said list 20 things, I don't think anybody could get anywhere near 20. So it feels like we've created a discussion about needs that may not actually exist.
Sometimes we use the terminology desire, which is kind of the same realm. But I think the overlying thing here is that this is a perceptions survey. So we're asking general perceptions. The methodology is scientific, but beyond that, most of the questions are generally asking, what do you think, or how do you feel, or what do you believe? So when it comes to that, I think that you've hit an interesting point. To say that these are things that respondents are kind of being force-fed and then replying that they need them because they're being fed these responses, I'm not sure I can agree with that sentiment. We do this all over the place. We've done it in past multi-million-dollar community projects, community indoor aquatic centers, indoor community centers, park trail enhancements.
So some of those big ones would be on my Safeway list, definitely. But like adult art programs, I can't think of any of my friends who would ask for adult art programs. Now, there might be somebody out there.
Yeah.
And I know we have an art community that's pretty active.
Yeah.
But it just feels to me like we've invented some of those things to get up to 20. But anyway, so that's a high-level concept there. The other one was kind of the question of, did you standardize for city size? So some things like theater, dance, painting, art, water fitness, swimming, aquatic center, it seems like a city of 22,000 would be managed different than a city of 60 or 80,000. And I didn't hear any discussion that this questionnaire was different or the expectations were different based on size of the city. So was there any standardization or thought to that?
Yes, so the lists we provide and then work with our community leaders, the lists provided are kind of standardized lists, and we use them throughout the country, but this one was a lot more custom than what you would find in other communities. So we give the organization the opportunity to kind of fill and create that list on their own, and then kind of provide some assistance or guidance as to this is what we ask nationally. And when we compare size of parks and recreation organizations, we don't find there to be a particular difference in a county organization to a city organization or even a state organization. And one thing to mention is we recently did Washtenaw County, which is kind of a college community centered in Michigan. And most of the facilities that were on your list were the same facilities on their list. And the priorities are almost, you could almost say that they're mirrored, or they're very similar. They're more similar than dissimilar. And so when we do this from county to city to state, we find that regardless of the size of the community, the facility importance and the PIR, the priority investment rating, tends to be the same regardless. So when it comes to customizing the list for communities, we do that, but we don't necessarily take size into account. We ask the community leaders to determine what is feasible for their community, and then build the list based on that.
So my third one relates to cost. That wasn't really taken into account. You said, with your, like I'm looking at a page, top priorities for investment for recreation facilities based on the priority investment rating. So it feels like cost, you're saying, what do you want? And we don't care about the cost. So like if they actually knew an aquatic center might cost 30 million and an off-leash dog park might cost 500,000, they might prioritize this different. So it feels like that's a huge piece of the puzzle that you're really not giving people. And when you said this is where a council could use to spend their, help decide where to spend your money, I totally disagree. I don't think that's a conclusion you can make from this at all, because you aren't asking anything about how much do you actually want to spend for that aquatic center. As long as it's free, sure, everybody wants everything. They don't care how much it costs.
Communities who are actually using the survey research to help plan and then maybe build an aquatic facility do ask tax-specific questions. So typically the priority investment question after the importance question is then followed up with, given our current situation, kind of a preamble, and then how much would you be willing to spend in additional tax money? Or if a bond referendum were passed that would increase, $30 per year for a house estimated $100,000, how likely would you be to vote in favor? So for communities that are actually entertaining that idea and going through that process, which is a little bit different than the process Kenmore's going through, we would ask those types of questions. In the frame of this survey, what this is more used for is helping just to kind of look into the future as to what the community desires, more so than how we're going to spend our parks and recreation dollars. So I do understand what you're saying, but we're not telling you necessarily that you should spend your money this way, or any support for, there's no support for tax funding for any of these items on this list, because we didn't ask those particular questions. And if we were going to go down that route, then we would suggest that we did additional research and probably an educational campaign to help inform respondents of how this data was going to be used. But understanding the update that's going on right now, we wouldn't make that inference of the data. So at ETC Institute, we wouldn't assume that the council or anybody at the city is going to spend their money for the priorities listed here. It's more of these are the priorities for the community if we want to fill need.
All right, thank you. I'll give everybody else a chance of general questions. I have a whole bunch of small ones too.
Councilmember Danuski.
Hi. This is all very good information, but I had a hard time kind of tying some of these questions together, especially like in the acquire shoreline for water beach access, which got a really high score. But then in all the facilities questions, there were no questions on, do you want a beach? Do you want a lookout? Do you want some trails near the water? And I would expect that that's probably what people are looking for with the water and shoreline access, is to be able to actually get there and use it. But none of those questions were anywhere in the survey. The closest thing was a hand-powered boat launch. So kind of curious how you picked what you asked for on that.
Is that on? Okay, thank you. As we vetted the questions for 15 and 13 and 15, which related to the facilities and recreation programming, we did ask council members what they thought should be on the list as well before we put that out. And one of the things that did rise to be on the list was non-motorized watercraft launches. As we know, we've got a very active community who's interested in getting access to the water. And yes, we didn't specifically say, you know, do you want waterfront property access? But we know from our previous experience since incorporation that that is a huge need. So it's more like what we were trying to find out in the following question about how supportive would you be for actions would be, you know, do you want more access than we currently have? Because we know we have very limited public access to the waterfront. So one question is just asking, you know, what facilities do you think you have a need for? And the other one is, how supportive are you for certain actions that the city would take?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it just would have been interesting to see like a pool versus a swimming beach, you know, which one would people like? And, you know, I don't know, that just that seemed to be a hole for me when I was looking at it, but.
I understand.
I just think, you know, this is always the case when you see the results. You kind of say, wouldn't it be nice if?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so
The
I think
hindsight
that's
thing.
a hindsight
Yeah.
kind of thing when you look at the results and you say, wouldn't it have been nice if we'd known a little bit more about what this high need actually means?
Yeah,
and
that's-
it's hard to say that because it's you then have that and then it's a question of follow-up. We might be able to get to some of that as we move forward through the public process and updating the pros plan to sort of delve a little bit deeper into some of those questions. But again, I think it's, you know, I think we take it for what it is. And I think on past surveys, we've seen results that access to the water is a high priority. And I think this is still an indication that it is a high priority and has been consistently community desire over the last several years as we've done surveys.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Councilmember Shribnick.
It would be interesting to understand further and probably do something like this in a few years again, which we probably will after we do the improvements related to waterways and walkways. Because I was trying to infer, well, do they mean now or knowing what they know or, you know, that kind of thing. And then the only other comment was, I was also struck by, you know, you know, adult fitness and things like that and indoor recreational. I mean, we have a number of private gyms in the city and close to it. And I just, you know, it's almost a comment for Rob, now that we have a rec coordinator, that there might be an opportunity for just, you know, getting the word out more about some of the things that we actually do have in the region, in the city.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. Your answer to your first question about survey results, and is that because people don't know what's coming and they're looking at what's now? I guess we'll only find out when we do this survey again, when we update the pros plan in 6 years, or we do an interim survey, because then it would be interesting to know once those facilities are constructed and built, will their need go down or up? We won't know. So it's hard to say. But again, it's good that that need is still being identified as a need, and the future question will be, will that have changed once those, like Squires Landing and Log Boom have been constructed, and that there's, you know, the boathouse has been built? You know, we'll guess we'll have to see.
If I can add to that, please. Yeah, so our new part-time recreation coordinator has already produced a draft recreation brochure. But you make a great point. I think if we did more of as a city to get the word out about what's out there and what's already being offered by both nonprofits and for-profits, and if we just helped educate the public on what recreation opportunities are already available through this recreation brochure and then the corresponding online work we're going to do. Maybe once we do that and really get that word out, then maybe the survey results might be a little bit different.
Just to follow up on Debbie's comment, I do think this is a really, ETC does a really great job of providing benchmarking information nationally, and I think for the city, if we can keep this same survey moving forward, you will start to see, like, this is almost our baseline kind of moving forward. And if you keep some of these questions the same and you don't change up the lists, and maybe we need to add more specific ones now that we know more about our community. But essentially, you're creating the baseline of knowledge. So the next time that we go to do this, you look at trends that change over time. And I think that's what's valuable about having such an in-depth survey. This is probably the most in-depth survey we've attempted thus far through the PROS plan process. So I think it's going to help us as we continue to decide what are our priorities and how is the community feeling about what we're doing and taking actions.
And just to add on to that, most oftentimes in our experience, the survey data is merely a tool to help springboard a conversation of what the community desires and needs and wants. And sometimes we do ask very specific questions, but that's usually led with, or not led, but prefaced with a whole discussion of what's going on in focus groups and public meetings and public hearings, and usually architectural firms are involved and things like that. This one is just like Maureen said, kind of a baseline, and what the community has done here is gotten a really good baseline of what the community thinks they need, and then it's how you react and then resurvey in 5, 6, 10 years to kind of readjust and then see what you've done and how that's worked. And we do understand that there are some inherent flaws to, you could always pick out something in the survey data or any data for that matter that could be that point that, well, I don't trust it anymore, or it's not completely valid to me for this reason or that reason. But what we pride ourselves in is the methodology. So we know that the results are statistically significant, and we know that to a certain degree. Beyond that, what we're really more so doing here is just trying to feel out how people think and feel and their perceptions of current parks and recreation offerings. And then it's the job of staff and community leaders to then kind of springboard that into action. How you do that over the next few years is going to be really important. And this should just be used to kind of help lead that discussion. And maybe in 6 years, the survey's purpose is a lot different, and we have maybe tax referendum questions and things like that. But as a baseline for a community like this, it's really just a springboard. And just so everybody knows, I'd be more than happy to take emails and additional follow-up questions, and even have phone calls if needed to discuss any other questions that may arise. So.
Councilmember Smith?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and explanation. I had just a simple question I wanted to ask you. You said that your sample size goal was 400 and it was 578. Was that? I mean, that was almost 50% better than expectation. I'm curious, approximately how many surveys do you send out?
Yeah, it's approximately 7 times what our goal is.
What the goal is.
Yep,
Okay.
and that's just an approximate. We do it in such a precise manner that it's always like an off number. But yeah, it's approximately.
And so does that, so if we were to do this again, for instance, would we only do it, this is for the PROS plan, but is this something we would do, would you envision us doing prior to the next PROS plan, or, okay.
Yeah.
I was just.
It's required for us to do that. The state requires a statistically valid survey to base our PROS plan decisions on.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask it correctly. What I meant to ask was, would we be doing this again prior to our next pros plan update after this one's already finished?
Yes.
Okay, okay, great. And one other, I guess that, no, that's it. Thank you.
Councilmember Curtis?
So just some quick comments on some of the areas that I thought were particularly useful. I might need some help because I just took little teeny notes. What's question 15?
That's our facilities question, I believe.
Yeah, so to me, it felt like we were doing pretty good in general of meeting a lot of the expectations of our community.
Definitely.
Question 8, items to add to parks. I found that really a useful, concise, not too expensive kind of a list and a way to think about things. Question 19, an adult fitness program. I think some of these, again, the difference, is it on your fridge list or on your, kind of, if somebody prompts me, I'll think about it. If we started some adult fitness programs, I think you'd have a really hard time getting enough people to show up. I don't think our gyms are here that are full and packed out. So there's some discrepancy here that I can't quite understand, even though it may be statistically valid. It doesn't pass the does this make sense test. So that's what I'm struggling with.
And that's where I talk about the over-reporting, and we try to filter that out with the importance question.
I like those questions.
Yeah.
Give me 3, your top 3, your top 4.
And when we rank them, we can typically weed through things. But a large group of respondents in the city of Kenmore indicated they had a need and it wasn't being completely met for those particular type of programs within the city. So the question do you have a need for this program in Kenmore? And then, as I mentioned, also word of mouth was the primary source of information for parks and recreation, type activities here in the community, which again can, sometimes stray people away. But being that you don't have a centralized programming system here, it could be kind of a reason for this. And if maybe those things are maybe not shored up, but maybe just the discussion is opened about where you can find those types of programs, in 5 years you might find that this is not a priority anymore, although it typically does rank in that top 5 or 10, regardless of where we're serving.
I think it's the reason there's so many gym memberships in January, and then there's lots of capacity by July.
Just wanted to mention that in terms of, Ryan already did a very good job of talking about who filled out our survey, but if you go back and look at the statistics, over half of the pie was over the age of 45. So you have to understand that our population is over 50 generally, when you look at that statistic, at least the folks that filled out our form, and they're representing their need. It doesn't mean that equates to gym membership. That means that they have an interest in being active their entire life. And so what we need to look at is what kind of programs are we going to have that we're either offering ourselves or being offered by others in our city that supports growing older to an older population that wants to stay active. So those are the kinds of things that we can gain out of the raw data. The raw data doesn't mean just gym membership. It can mean a lot more. And so that's what we need to explore in the pros plan process.
Councilmember Smith?
Yeah, I have one more thing to add on based on question 19. So if you see what the top percentage, as Councilmember Curtis said, was adult fitness and wellness programs, that is almost verbatim what is the program title, I think, at the North Shore Senior Center. And so, and I mean that seriously, they have an incredible number of programs there. And then even right below that, a few lines is programs for adults over 50. And so maybe part of the problem, or part of the solution, I should say, is to do, maybe we can include a little bit in our newsletter that goes out to our citizens that maybe gives them a little more information on what's happening at the senior center. And it might provide some additional benefit. So just a thought.
Garden at my house. I've got some extra work.
Any other questions, comments? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time.
Next up, we've got staff report.
Nothing.
All right. Councilmember reports, comments, and initiatives. Councilmember Smith.
Nothing to add, thank you.
Councilmember Marshall.
I was at work today, doing my job at Snohomish County Public Defender, getting people out of jail on the Edmonds Municipal Court calendar. Judge Linda Coburn, before beginning the calendar, said, "Mr. Marshall, I read an article about the city of Kenmore and the great progressive work that you're doing to save the mobile home parks." And I was totally floored because that my personal, this life has never gone into my vocational life, but she just wanted to emphasize that she thought the council and the city reflected very well on the city to be progressive about it, and she saw that. So I just wanted to tell you guys that.
Councilmember Curtis.
Nothing to add, but I was wondering if somebody could, I'm not quite tech savvy enough to get that article on the mobile home parks from the newspaper. I just saw it was great, and I can't figure out how to find it or get it. So if somebody can find a link and send it to all of us.
All right. Councilmember Shrubnik.
Just a couple things, a similar reflection to Councilmember Marshall. I work at King County, and I had people coming out of the woodwork there and elsewhere in praise of what we were doing in the city around mobile home parks. So it's people are reading it and they are appreciating it. And then the second appreciation is apparently we are the only city in our small region of a handful of cities that has a emerging complete census count committee. And so I'm very proud to be associated with that effort and to have that effort happening.
Councilmember Danuski.
Nothing to add.
Yeah, and my parents even brought up the Seattle Times thing, which usually they have no idea what I'm doing when I say I'm going to a council meeting or doing council work. It's outside of their realm of things they fully understand, but they saw that, so it was good coverage. It was great. I'm happy what we did. All right, well, if there's nothing else come before us, City Council is adjourned.